Alright, let's go ahead and talk about an interesting trio of new releases. And let's go ahead and start with Cry Macho, another theater slash HBO Max release. This being Eastwood's new movie. And what's interesting about this is it has the novelty of being the first post 90 Clint Eastwood. Because I think he's going to be 92 next year. So, yeah, and that's one of those cases where you wonder, like, how much is, like, you hear about how some of his crews have been really taking over and how much of it is actually him. Once we saw one of his old producers do, like, Trouble with the Curve, and it was basically an Eastwood movie with another director's name. But he's still proven that he clearly has his particular vision, and you see that immediately. Like, there's one of those cases where I was kind of looking for it. We even have the new Warner Brothers logo that we've had since the beginning of the year, and it's like even that just immediately like has the Eastwood tone. Where like the Warner Brothers logo is like the black and the gray that we see at the beginning. So it's all still purely Eastwood, and the opening shots and all that really give you that vibe. And we're starting in 1979 briefly before we jump ahead to 1980. Um, and I think, despite the whole thing of a lot of the novelty of this movie being his age, I'm pretty sure this character is supposed to be younger, but I don't think they really establish that explicitly. But even so, even if he's supposed to be like maybe in his 70s or something, he's got an awful lot of backstory that we get in very clumsy exposition in this first scene with Dwight Yoakam. That sets up that he was once like this big rodeo star. Then he had an accident, and he lost his wife and kid. And it's been a very eventful life that you'd expect from a Clint Eastwood character, basically. Um, and he's still got those moments of like the character has like a sense of humor that always seems to go unnoticed. Like he'll just make little comments here and there. And so the character is likable right away, and then he is given this assignment to go get Dwight Yoakam's kid, basically because he owes him, and it goes from there. It's one of those things where you think it might be the journey to, but it's actually the journey back, is what a lot of the movie is. Because in the meantime, he has to get the kid from the mother, and you think that sets itself up as a conflict that does kind of continue throughout it because she has like bodyguards that follow them back. And then it's pretty brief. It's actually like refreshingly brief. Him having to talk the kid into coming with him because the kid is there and he does the cockfighting, and his yes, they do make a joke out of this. His cock is named Macho, which Eastwood finds a way to use the wordplay on that, of course. But you can imagine. I watched it just on HBO Max, but I could just hear like old people laughing, just just like in spirit. But going on that in this whole journey back, and another case of Eastwood being with a younger actor, kind of might bring back something like Memories of Gran Torino or something like that. But it is one of those cases where you want to talk about. I don't want to dwell on the whole age thing, but I feel like it's such a major player in this, and just this movie's whole production in general, and the way people are going to view it. Because it is like amazing especially for like really any movie lover when you have a director's filmography go this far and a director's life go this far, and the fact that they're still working and still putting movies out regularly. Because I remember people feeling like when The Mule came out, and it's like, man, it's kind of a stretch, him playing this character and stuff like that. And The Mule's like 3 years old now. I kept thinking it was a couple years ago, but it was late 2018. And there is another case where everybody made a big deal out of The Mule and the fact that he had like three ways in it. They were off screen and implied, but people made a huge deal out of that. There is an attempted seduction from Dwight Yoakam's ex-wife to Eastwood. That's kind of uncomfortable and weird. But there's also those cases where even though there is a certain magic to the fact that Eastwood is still making movies and still starring in them, it might have the opposite effect if you can like notice. Because it's like there's always going to be a magic of still seeing him on screen even now, and still like this, like when he's gone, this is going to be the kind of thing that we're really going to miss. To where it's like all the way up to this point, we were able to anticipate another movie from him and be able to see him on screen. But as I said, there's some cases where it kind of backfires a little bit, and it actually ends up a little depressing and kind of sad unintentionally. Like there's a point in time when he's being escorted out, and you get the sense that these bodyguards of the mother are violent, and they show that throughout the movie while they track them down. But when he's leaving, the mother says aggressively, "Throw him out," and you can imagine with another actor, because this script has apparently been around forever, and it took this long to get made, and there was going to be a bunch of different people making it. When you hear the way the mother says "throw him out," you get the idea of the bodyguard grabbing somebody harshly and pushing them out the door. And I'm going to assume that's probably how the script had it, like that was the original idea. But he lays these violent bodyguards throw him out by laying a gentle hand on his shoulder and guiding him out. And I feel like that's not the intended effect of that scene. And then there's stuff later, like when he's like riding and he's kind of reliving that whole rodeo thing, and you can just kind of see in the editing, like the editing is very obvious, but we'll get some stunt performer that looks significantly younger in like the wide shots, and then when we get closer, he's just kind of Eastwood from like here up. And it's stuff like that where you can see them having to go around that. It can have the opposite effect of that magic of just seeing him in general. So, but like I said, there's still, something there. And it is also, like, that is another thing, though, is the whole idea of the way he famously makes movies, where he does, like, the one or two takes and then he moves on, and that's how he's able to do so many so quickly and have the extensive filmography that he's had. But here it is like maybe it's that as well as them having to cut around just him being as old as he is. But as far as that goes, also we have the young actor playing the kid, and while he's not like a bad actor or anything, it is one of those cases where you can tell in his dialogue that he's should be having like a lot of big scenes, but they don't really quite land. It's one of those cases where you can hear it in the dialogue, but the emotion isn't in it, and it's like you get the sense of this probably would have been a really really big scene if there was a bit more of a performance here. But that's another thing where it's like thinking about Eastwood working with younger actors, more inexperienced actors, and it's like, do they also like, are they hindered by the fact that he only does a couple of takes and then moves on really quickly? When it's like with a more inexperienced actor, you might normally give them more time to kind of get into scenes or get into roles and kind of find that ground. But if you're going through like the Eastwood pace, if that might be detrimental to a more inexperienced actor, maybe. So there is that. And then eventually, like it is kind of nice watching them go. Like it has this almost episodic nature to it, and it's like the different kind of characters they're gonna run into on their journey back, and the kind of trouble they might find themselves into, and that's a thing for a while. And then at about like the halfway mark here, a contrivance gets them stuck in one town, and then that's when you can kind of feel, because they do meet a woman that runs like a restaurant, I think, that at first glance almost gives you the vibe of like, oh, is this going to be his love interest or something? But then they start to move on again. And you're like, oh, it was a nice scene, so by itself, so that's nice. But then the contrivance gets them stuck in this town and they have to stay here, which means they end up back at the restaurant and repeatedly running into this woman, and then you realize this is going to be what the movie is. And it does feel like the movie like hits the brakes like quite a bit, noticeably. And it's I think the time that I noticed was when they realized they were going to be stuck in the town. They took shelter in this like small church of sorts, and so they went inside, and they sleep, and then the next morning there's like a breakfast laid out for them outside. And it's like, oh, that's nice. Maybe like some priest or something left that for them. It's like, this is a nice scene. And then it's her from the restaurant. And it's like, oh, so she's going to be in the movie from now on. And the direction I initially thought this was going of him having a love interest is going to be the thing. So then that's pretty much where the movie goes. And it's, yeah, it leaves a lot to be desired. It did have a lot more going for it, I think, with the whole idea of them, like, running into various different characters and various different types of people on their journey back, but obviously they got really caught up in having to have some sort of narrative here, which there already kind of is with them being kind of tracked by the mom's bodyguards, even if that's kind of just here and there every now and then. You don't really need a through line that is like really, really apparent. Like if you just have one small connecting thing, that's really all it takes, as long as your sort of individual moments are interesting enough. But yeah, we kind of just stop with the whole individual moments thing, and then it becomes watching them, ride horses, and it gets very repetitive, and then eventually some sort of drama will happen. That once, like everything else, feels quite contrived until they just eventually say, "Well, we should probably get back now." And then every now and then we still get these moments that are a bit surprisingly suspenseful, I guess you could say, but they're also kind of short-lived. Like a lot of these individual moments have like really anticlimactic payoffs. So yeah, so it always feels like it's headed right towards something, and then it always like just completely hits the brakes on it, like it's afraid to go like one step further with really any scene that it has. And I suppose maybe that could be the point in how it's clear that it's meant to be a bit more of a contemplative movie than something more action oriented would be too strong of a word for the setup, but that whole idea of it just having something like that, where it plays up more into that sort of suspense angle that some of the scenes have to them, even if they don't particularly go anywhere ever, really. But I could see those being two different movies, a more contemplative movie and a movie that builds more on its suspense. But I don't think this movie is either one of those. There would be better ways to do both things this movie's trying to do. So it's just kind of stuck here in the middle, and it's like I said, it's not bad, and it's not as aggressively boring as that might make it sound. But it gets easy to kind of, you have to really strain. I personally had to strain quite a bit to maintain focus once we got to that second half, and it started to kind of stay in the same territory and go in these predictable directions. So that's pretty much how I feel about it. It's just kind of here. It just kind of exists. I do wonder, talking about Eastwood's filmography, because we don't know how much longer he's going to go. Like, God forbid this, there's a scenario where this could be his last movie, or there's another scenario where this could be his, like, fifth to last movie. If not more, at the pace that he goes. Sometimes he puts out 2 a year. But so maybe this will fare more down the road when we see it amongst what will eventually be his finished filmography. And then that might maybe add a little more weight to it, which might seem like it's, being too easy on it, but those things do come into play when you're dealing with a director as prolific as Eastwood is. So, and doing parts like this, where you can tell he's kind of in that sort of settling down territory, in that more contemplative territory. But as far as the movie itself goes, like I said, it leaves a lot to be desired. So, but it's harmless, I guess, which is kind of a throwaway compliment, but that's pretty much the movie in a nutshell. So, let's go on to Copshop, which is a movie that kind of snuck up on me because here's the thing. I tend to get excited when I hear Joe Carnahan's name, especially when he's been like signed on to a few things that have sounded exciting, but then ultimately went elsewhere, just kind of faded out. And now he's done 2 movies this year, and I actually missed boss level, which I have been meaning to get to, so I'll probably do that very soon. Like now that I've had Copshop as a reminder, I will probably watch boss level like this week or something. Um, and in this movie will get you in the mood to do that also, because a Carnahan movie is definitely a Carnahan movie. It is one of those cases where you can see other movies and other directors in his work at times, and it's kind of especially in this. But he's also definitely got his own brand as well. And what I really liked about it right away was there was something that kind of surprised me, which was I didn't know much about the movie at all. I had no idea what the plot was or what the setup was. All I knew was that the main people in it were Gerard Butler and Frank Grillo, and this whole opening scene where Frank Grillo is coming into town very quickly, and it's clear that he's a sort of there's something dangerous about him, and he's being chased by something potentially lethal. And on the other side of this, cutting back and forth from Frank Grillo running from something, and these two cops that are just kind of hanging out here in the middle of nowhere at like a food truck. And there's this woman who is a cop, and she's showing off a gun of hers. And I was thinking like, oh, this character seems pretty cool. This character seems pretty badass. But I just kind of brushed that off because I was under the assumption, because when you see the very opening scene of a movie and you see a potentially dangerous character coming very quickly from one direction, and you see two cops here who are kind of none the wiser and just sort of hanging out, typically you're under the impression those cops are about to die. Uh, so I just kind of assumed that was gonna, like, these are just gonna be a couple of ill-fated cops. They get caught in the crossfire, whatever this opening scene's gonna be. And it turns out that this woman, this cop, is basically the main character through the whole movie, which I had no idea of, because I don't know that I recognize the actress. Her name is Alexis Louder, I think, and I don't recall having seen her before, but yeah, she made an impression quickly, but I kind of thought she was just going to be a throwaway character that we only saw in this scene. But she's probably more of a player in this than, like, Butler and Grillo, as far as, like, screen time and their presence as a character. So that was fun to discover. And, yeah, going into it, once it has its nice setup, where Frank Grillo is being chased by something lethal, and that is Gerard Butler. I should have been able to figure that out pretty quickly, but... and they have this idea of getting themselves jailed, so that Grillo does it to get away from him, and he does it to get to Grillo. And then we have this whole scenario where they're in their cells, and we go from here. And the first half is very dialogue heavy, which is really nice. And it does have the vibe of other movies, like Assault on Precinct 13 is going to immediately come to mind, I'm assuming. And then there is The Last Stand, with the Schwarzenegger movie from a while back that I really loved. It was off the radar, but I really, really loved that movie, and it was giving me vibes of that. So I was feeling good about going into this movie, and like I said, with Carnahan kind of having his own sort of style, I guess this would be a good time to praise Carnahan in general, and then why that bleeds into this movie specifically. Is the thing that I really love about him is how many different things he can do. Like, typically when I think Carnahan, I think of, like, just crazy action, just in general. Like, when you talk about a movie being, like, a movie can be Carnahan-esque, you would think, like, Smoking Aces and Stretch. And Smoking Aces and Stretch are, like, just purely him. Like, that's his own style that's immediately recognizable, and you can see other lesser directors doing it later. Like, no-name directors, you could say, are basically ripping off Carnahan. But the thing that really brought him forward was Narc, which was like this really grounded and gritty story that was almost kind of the opposite of his other movies, because while Narc definitely has like over-the-top moments and like the way it's shot, it's like the story itself is like has that constantly sort of grounded feel when you look at stuff like Smoking Aces and Stretch that are like really like almost intentionally cartoonish in a way, in the way they're shown off, but in a really good way. But then he's also done like a really serious survival drama with The Grey, which was marketed as a big action movie and wasn't for the most part. And he handled that so well, and it feels so different from all of his other movies. And then with something like The A-Team, which I wasn't the biggest fan of, but it's like being able to handle a studio movie amongst all these, like seeing all the other stuff he can do, and then to make this studio movie that was handled like he didn't shit the bed with the studio movie, which some directors tend to do. So he's done all these different things, and the way that bleeds into this movie is I feel like he brings a lot of that eclectic nature to what he can do into this, because how I was talking about the first half is much more sort of ground, like you get kind of an over the top sense in the opening scene where it's kind of setting you up for the action that's to come. But once we're actually like the two of them are in the cells and it's so dialogue heavy, we're kind of slowly building like little pieces of a plot here. It does have a sort of grounded nature to it that you can imagine the director of Narc making. And it's like how this could have easily been its own movie, like just set in this portion of the station, and then that's pretty much it. And focusing on these two characters, that could have been its own thing by itself and probably would have been great. And then there's the other thing that Carnahan does really well, which is action and a lot of guns going off and colorful characters. And that comes through I think pretty much directly at the halfway mark. That's what it felt like when, of all people, Toby Huss walks in. And I've been praising Toby Huss for quite some time. Most people my age probably first saw him as Artie in Pete and Pete. And he's been in seemingly every other movie that's come out or every other TV show that's come out. And he's always this really welcome presence, and he's usually always playing a totally different character than the last time you saw him. And never was that more apparent here, where he gets a pretty major role, which I am ecstatic about. And not only, like, I would have been ecstatic anyway that Toby Huss had as big of a part as he did in a movie like this, but the performance itself and the character himself is on like a whole. It takes the movie to like a whole other over the top level, and it's kind of this perfect contrast to the more grounded stuff that Butler and Grillo are doing, and that's kind of what I was really liking about this. Also, was that like this is the kind of case where I heard like a lot of I remember when a while back when it came out, there were a lot of people that had problems with how many different tones Smokin' Aces had. Smokin' Aces is basically like 10 different movies with 10 different tones in just one movie. I still love that movie, but I can see where it could kind of there could be a lack of balance or seem like there's a sort of lack of a grasp, I guess, on the concept itself or the tones themselves and establishing everything. But here, the way it feels like it's split up into two different parts, where it's the entire first half is the more grounded movie, and Butler and Grillo just doing their thing and going into these characters and seeing where they're coming from, sets up something in itself in a way that is completely different from the total balls-to-the-wall action movie that's the second half, and the way one kind of seems like it's building to the other, because you have that, like, if it were a movie that was just dialogue-driven, these scenes would kind of build and build, and then there'd be some sort of fireworks at the end of it, whether it be bigger dialogue or bigger performances or something. But when we see that's building to literally the second half of the movie being a whole gunfight, everything feels as earned as it could, which is great. I had heard that I heard something about a controversy about Frank Grillo and Carnahan specifically being upset with the movie that we're seeing, because on the surface you could probably say that it doesn't feel like there's much here for the Butler and Grillo part, specifically the Grillo part. And apparently it was a whole thing, if I heard correctly, I kind of just skimmed through this. Apparently there was like a lot more to Grillo's character, and he had a lot more to work with, like performance-wise, and as far as this character in general. And I guess a lot of it got cut. And it was... And I heard something about, like, there was the cut that Grillo and Carnahan wanted, and there was the cut that Gerard Butler wanted, is what I heard, and it was Gerard Butler's cut, is the cut that we're seeing. So, but I didn't mind too much about how the characters were set up, but it does intrigue me if there was more to Grillo's character, and I would hopefully that cut can end up on like a Blu-ray or something. It would be interesting to see this more because I don't think like I mean it's always good when characters are fleshed out regardless of the kind of movie they're in. But this is also the kind of movie where if the characters aren't completely fleshed out, it's not something that I get too bent out of shape about. But if there is something richer in the character work that's not here that was supposed to be, I would be interested in seeing what that was. As I'm sure it would always add some sort of other layer to this, as entertaining as it is already. So there is that, but yeah. So with the second half being this balls to the wall action movie, and the character played by Toby Huss being this really over the top villain who has this seemingly he does have a seemingly endless arsenal, though he does run out of bullets a lot as well, which is one of those sort of almost Elmer Leonard like problems that people run into in movies like this, where in another movie it would just be endless nonstop. But those little quirks pop in and they're kind of nice. I can easily see people saying this feels a little too Guy Ritchie, and I could probably agree with that to a certain extent. Much like Ritchie, there's some cases where you catch the dialogue almost trying a little too hard to be cool, and not quite getting there, but still succeeds for the most part. And there's also some really cool visual things done here, which Sonny Carnane also does really well. There's one particular scene that really stands out, where it's Toby Huss and another guy are looking at the sort of like blueprint of the building. And the way this is shot is the blueprint is put on top of the table like we're looking through it, like through a glass table or something. And we see their shadows on the other side of it as they're planning on what they're going to do. And stuff like that is really cool when you can add in little visual flares like that to a movie that's already pretty flashy in itself. Just adds to the whole cool experience. And there's... like I said, just seeing the whole completely over-the-top nature of it and how characters can be so unpredictable, particularly Huss's character, like how not only is he just, completely and totally trigger-happy and the deadliest person in the movie, the references that he makes are kind of out of nowhere. There's like a Last Samurai reference. There is a reference to not only Chris Hemsworth, but Chris Hemsworth's wife, who this character knows by name. And it's like those kind of things. And that's the kind of thing where some people might think it's like doesn't work or it's just kind of too weird. But I think the thing I like about it is it made me ask more questions about his character. Like it genuinely made me wonder why a character like this would know the name of Chris Hemsworth's wife. And stuff like that can get you drawn in really easily. And I think another thing that I liked about the dynamic of Butler and Grillo, even if they seem almost like they're on the sidelines sometimes with all the action that's going on, and if not all the scenes are here, is that it feels like it's kind of constantly toying with you, because when you get two actors that, headline their own movies, like Gerard Butler and Frank Grillo coming together, you get the sense that since one of them is being chased by the other, one of them is a hero of the story and one of them is a villain of the story. And it basically plays with your expectations of that seemingly constantly. Like, you're kind of constantly asking yourself, is one of these guys going to be somebody that I side with, or is it going to be just an all-out thing? So asking that question throughout was really fun to kind of see play out. And there's it does get weaker as it goes. Once we kind of get to the end, and when more characters start to get picked off, it starts to feel almost anticlimactic, despite all the action that's been going on. And it's cases like we've lost that character already, and it's you're never quite it's kind of hard to tell when it's getting towards its climax, which is something that should probably build a bit more gradually, but. I mean, with all the action that's going on here still, it's it's not the action itself that gets tiresome. It was just kind of like as we were headed, it felt like we were headed more in a particular direction. Would have probably helped a bit because there is like a plot going on here, but it's very very thin. Like I said, that's kind of another thing though, kind of going on the whole flesh out characters thing of in a movie like this, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot, but like maybe just enough to where we can get a sense that we're going somewhere. And it kind of started to feel a bit directionless by the time we got to the end until we got to like its final moments, and then yeah, but it kind of lost me there just as we were getting like in that middle ground of almost to the climax to what the climax actually is. And I don't entirely know how I feel about the very end either. But it's the strengths of the movie kind of overshadow anything that's might be a bit of a weaker aspect. So yeah, it's fun as you would imagine a Joe Carnahan movie to be, which is it's not. I wouldn't say it's as fun as something like Stretch, because Stretch was just so out of left field and amazing. But it's a very good addition to his filmography, and it's getting me amped to see what Boss Level is all about because I hear it's a bit like well it's definitely crazier and has a much more sort of over the top concept which I don't really know going in, so I'll just go pretty much blind into that and see what happens. But I'm very excited about it. So let's finish with Prisoners of the Ghostland, which I mentioned when I was doing my Cage catch-up video recently. I couldn't quite remember the title, I don't think, at the time, but this is a movie that did have a lot of hype around it because not only is it another Nicolas Cage movie, which I always get excited about, even if sometimes we get Willy's Wonderland, we also get really great stuff. Also, even some of his middling stuff, I've gotten a lot of joy out of. So I was gonna be excited for this regardless. It wasn't until after the fact that I realized it is a Shion Sono movie who did. Now, he's got an extensive filmography. I have only seen so far, besides this, Why Don't You Play an L, which left a massive impression. That toothpaste jingle is never leaving ever, and it's I could get lobotomized and that toothpaste jingle would still be in there. And adding that, like just going that on that, like only knowing him from this movie up to this point, and him collaborating with Cage, I think this is his first English language movie. That in itself is like okay, that's there's almost unreasonable expectations here. And if that wasn't enough, I did get a glimpse at I try to avoid advertising and stuff like that, but I did see the poster, and I know people were making a big deal out of the quote that was on it, where typically you'd have a quote from like a film festival or a critic or something, or even a fellow director. It was a quote from Cage himself saying, "This is the wildest movie I've ever made," or something like that. And then I think I was reading somewhere where he said he was misquoted because he said it's the wildest script he'd ever read, but then he stood by and said that pretty much translates to wildest movies ever made anyway. So the bar could not have been higher. So it's almost like, is it even fair to judge the movie based on those expectations? Because because how much more could you ask of this? Well, you can. It's pretty easy to tell where this movie started to fall apart. So like even if you're basing it on really high expectations, there are specific places where the movie doesn't live up to that, and you can really tell. Like even if you had low expectations, you can tell what's good about the movie and what isn't. So when it starts off, it is a bit jarring because we're bombarded with a lot of seemingly disconnected imagery. A lot of which is very bright and colorful. Some of it appears to be in like a Western setting. Some of it in like this sort of, Japanese or like samurai setting. And like we're in different time periods is what it seems like. We don't realize right away that this is just all present day. And just a lot of different worlds colliding, like literally. We get this whole thing of Nicolas Cage and Nick Cassavetes committing a robbery, and just the imagery in this scene alone is like so bright. Like everything's really white, and then there's like a gumball machine, and just like everything, it's just like you're being assaulted with colors, but in a really interesting way. And that continues through all the other imagery as well. And then as this goes on and more is revealed, we realize that we're in this post-apocalyptic setting with like two different worlds. We got the samurai setting over here, and then we've got this western setting over here. And like I said, it's all in the same area, and they've all been split up by this explosion we hear about a bit late in some draining exposition. But looking at it, obviously there's going to be a lot of comparisons to there's going to be Fury Road comparisons, I'm sure. Which is really interesting because we do have an Immortan Joe-like ruler that has his, slew of girlfriends that he refers to as his daughters. And while this whole setup does have that vibe, it's actually the other side, the Ghostland, that feels like the Citadel from Fury Road. So it's like a kind of a meshing of, like, it's like the world of Fury Road split up into separate worlds. Weird. It's a lot to explain, but just so it's obviously visually is where it's at. They do try to explain it later, but that's when the movie's starting to kind of wear itself out. But so all that's really important is how well this is established. And you can see it's one of those cases where it doesn't feel completely cheap. Like you can see extras, like it feels like endless extras, and it's like stuff like that is refreshing when it's like literally everything is done the cheap way or the CGI way or whatever. Not that this movie is completely out of that realm, but as far as just getting the setting right, like as disconnected as it feels, I imagine that's the idea, because it's just kind of a disconnected world at this point, a very disorienting world at this point. But then after you're done making all the Mad Max comparisons, it's basically the concept is Cage being a one-man Suicide Squad, up to and including the explosive collar. But it's not just an explosive collar, he's got explosives in his arms and his balls. So that's clearly may or may not come into play. And the villain who is setting this all up, our Morton Joe-esque figure, is just called the Governor, and it's Bill Moseley. Extremely over-the-top Bill Moseley, though. Is there really any other Bill Moseley? And do we want any other Bill Moseley? We don't. This is the kind of performance that made him, the level of over-the-top he's able to find. I talked about this when I talked about The Devil's Rejects. How there's a certain level of over-the-top that Bill Moseley has mastered to where it's always a lot, but it's never too much, I think. And he more or less finds it here. This character's maybe where characters like Otis and Chop kind of fit into their world. You do get the sense that it's a very out there character, despite the fact that he's, as far as comparing him to Otis or Chop, relatively normal. Like he seems more or less human. While Otis was human, he wasn't really in mine, but and he's just kind of doing this over-the-top Southern accent, Colonel Sanders kind of thing, which is interesting enough for this movie. Like, if it was another actor that wasn't Bill Moseley, I would have either hated this performance or just kind of brushed it off, but he's going to always bring something to... When you ask for an over-the-top character and you cast Bill Moseley, you're going to get something worthwhile. Even if the movie around him may not be cooperating, which we've also talked about before. And he's another one where it's like pairing him up with Cage. With Cage having this hero part. Literally, his name is Hero, apparently, according to the credits. I can't tell if that's a name or just saying he's the hero of the story, and that's what it is, because I think he just goes unnamed completely. So that's how they do that. But Bill Moseley is the one that sends, because Sofia Boutella has gone into the Ghostland, and Cage has to go in there to get her. With all these things attached to him, which is the sort of Suicide Squad thing going on. So if he tries to, do anything or violate her or anything like that, those explosives will start going off. And taking out his limbs before they take him out. And his most important parts. And this is an interesting enough setup, and then when we see this whole land that Bill Moseley runs, and then he goes into the Ghostland, and we see it's much more of the Mad Max-like area. It's interesting to see the contrast, where everything in this world, as really dark and sinister as it is, it's really bright. And like I said, we're basically being assaulted with colors, and like everybody's singing in this really creepy way. And then over here, it's just this abandoned nothingness. But then there's the whole thing, the whole contrast of the characters in this much more dystopian looking place, in this much more dangerous looking place, maybe not as dangerous as the people that are in the colorful, happier looking place. Um, so that whole thing is going on here, and it's nice and it's set up well. But then and we get like this really massive reveal of the land and something. Like I said, the scope of the movie feels really big in a way that a cheaper looking movie would have. That would have just been another reason that the movie was falling apart, and it wouldn't have been able to grab us the way this movie does in its first third or so. We would have just immediately dismissed it as, oh, this is another stupid and cheap Cage movie. There was definitely commitment here as far as the production goes, but then as far as like a story element and I guess you could say an action element, but the thing is there's not really any action by the end after it's already run out of gas. So even if the action was well crafted, you're kind of don't really care by that point, unfortunately, because pretty much there's a portion here in the middle shortly after he gets to the Ghostland where this movie hits the brakes so hard. And not only does it hit the brakes, but it never fully recovers from it. Like I said, they can throw nearly anything in like the second half of this or the 2/3 of this, and it loses its way quickly. It loses its luster really quickly, and all the stuff, all the background stuff, all the production values, kind of stop doing the job. That can only take you so far, and then you just start completely losing interest. And like a lot of it is the flashbacks that we don't really, because you don't really need the history of the setting in a place, especially with how late that it comes in. Like with this kind of setting, it's interesting enough by itself, and you can maybe speculate in your mind or with other people how it got this way. But it kind of just speaks for itself as far as a visual and establishing what it is about how the worlds work. Now, like it's like to where it hardly matters how they came to be. But we delve a lot into that, and it's not as interesting as it could have been. But there's also something bizarre here. It's just bizarre to say, talking about how this movie you can lose interest in this really fast. Once he's over there, he's unconscious for a lot of this. Like it felt like he was unconscious a lot, and just having like visions, and then it's like when you're in this kind of world that's as vast as you've set up and as interesting as you've set up, why would you want to have the main character, who is Nicolas Cage, who thrives in worlds like this? It was weird. It was weird how unconscious he was for a lot of this movie. And like you said, you get the Cage moments you might come here for. There's one, like, he has a way of, like, screaming one particular word in mid-sentence. Like, that's one of the Cage-isms. And the word of choice, in this particular case, that he decides to scream at the top of his lungs, is an interesting choice. So, but it also starts to feel long. Like, when the action finally kicks in at the end, the action we've kind of been waiting for. Like I said, not only is the movie just dragged us on by this point, and we're just drained and we don't care anymore, but it feels like dragged out. Like, it feels like the ending is long. And this is when we should be really amped up by this point. Like, it should have been... Like, you can have all your action at the end if you want to, but you kind of got to get us amped along the way and have us build to that in a way that we're really invested in it and we're really psyched about being in this world and seeing what these characters are capable of. And at least in my case, I really, really wasn't. Just the drabness and the dullness, which is so crazy to say about a movie from this director with its main star, it's like unthinkable that that's the direction this would go. Like, you would think this was either going to be really, really amazing or really, really bad. But even really, really bad Cage it's like the Cage we want to see on top of the really, really good Cage. It's that middle ground where things are boring, where things get really bad. Like I've always talked about, where it's like when you think about, the notoriously bad movies like The Room or Marathons of Fate or Plan 9 or something, and it's like, yeah, those are some of the worst movies ever, but I don't get any entertainment out of them because I think the worst thing about them is that they're boring, and because that's the worst thing you can be. Like even if you're a really bad movie, if you're like exciting in some way or something's at least happening, you can get by. I think the worst movies ever made are the boring movies. And while this isn't one of the worst movies ever made or anything, that's just a point I was making in general. That's the worst thing that could have happened to this movie, was eventually getting boring, and it does it shockingly fast, and like I said, never recovers, weirdly enough. Even the reunion of Cage and Nick Cassavetes after Face Off, of all things, it's like, it was awesome to see them together, but then it's like, in their later scenes, it's like, oh, I just don't care about the movie anymore. That's unfortunate. So, yeah. So that's a bummer. So I guess we're just gonna leave that at this, because what else are we gonna do? So, um, that was those. Our next, we have a couple of things coming up that are new releases. I'm not sure what all they are, but at least a couple off the top of my head. And then we're gonna continue with all the other stuff we've been doing, verses and franchises and all that stuff. I think we have one more mini series coming with Scenes from a Marriage, so we'll probably talk about that. I needed like a last minute filler spot, so that's probably what that's going to be. And then we'll go from there until we get to October, which is very soon. So until the next thing, I think that's it.